we will talk about two specific terms, namely fluidity and continuum, in order to understand the complexities in the relationship between language and society. In fact, these two terms help us understand true nature of language in society. We have looked at the nature of language in terms of its structural relations with the components at the level of sounds, words and sentences. Today, we are going to be looking at the nature of language in society, the nature of language in the real world, and how it projects itself as a very fluid system. And therefore, we say fluidity, which transforms itself into a continuum, happens to be true nature of language in the real society. By real society, once again we mean the world, the surroundings, nearby places where we use language. So, we will examine these two terms, what we mean by them and how they work in the next few minutes for us to understand the term language in society today. To begin with, we wanted to start with the idea that it is difficult to count languages. Now, I want you to consider this in terms of a question: how many languages are spoken around you? How many languages do you speak? How many languages are spoken in your city? How many languages are spoken in your state? And eventually, how many languages are spoken in India or around the world? We can expand the scope of geography, but it is very difficult to answer these questions precisely for the reason that it is difficult to count languages. Now, I want you to understand this term with some seriousness, and only in the context. We are not saying that there aren't several languages. We are only saying that the idea to count them is difficult, and we will justify why we say it is difficult and what we mean by such a difficulty. Let us examine this. This is because we do not know where one language stops and the other begins, and that is the precise reason why it is difficult to count language. We will situate it in a proper context for us to understand. And this is why probably nobody knows the total number of languages. In fact, if you start at an individual level with the question that how many languages do you speak, you can come up with the numbers like 1 or 2 or 3. But the point is, how do we distinguish one with the other? Do we make sure that they do not merge with one another, or do we merge them on purpose? These are the tricky questions which help us understand the fluidity and continuum. We will get back to this point once again, but last time we have looked at the two terms standard and non-standard in the context of language. Let us look at it very briefly once again in this context of the two terms of fluidity and continuum. When we want to establish the distinction or similarities between language and varieties, we have one what we call language as a superstructure, and then we have several variants of that which are known as different varieties or dialects of that. So, if we take the example of Hindi, that will serve as a superstructure, and several varieties of Hindi, that is the several distinct varieties which are spoken at different places in the world would constitute its variants from Punjab, Delhi, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Haryana, Rajasthan, Bihar, Bengal and Assam, and several other places. I am only naming a few. Hindi spoken in these places have their own distinct identities. As a superstructure term, we call them Hindi, we call this Hindi, but they are a group of varieties with their local identities. The idea that we associate the term standard with the language and non-standard with its varieties or dialects crashes very soon, because the whole point that the language exists does not hold its ground. If you understand it carefully, you will know that the superstructure does not exist. What really exists is varieties of language. Therefore, everything would be what one would want to call non-standard. Hence, the distinction between the two would not make much of a point. Therefore, no distinction between standard and non-standard. When we put this point that there is no distinction between standard and non-standard, we do not want to make it as a statement which could have potential for being politically correct. The non-existence of the distinction between standard and non-standard is not a politically correct statement, rather it is how language looks on the ground and how we understand technicalities underlying language is the point that we are trying to make with the non-existence of the distinction between standard and non-standard. So, once again we establish the point that in societies people speak only varieties, people speak only dialects, and they are all the same. There is no question of a standard and non-standard. Given that, and given the human ability to negotiate between varieties, this is the point where we begin the question of multilinguality, that even the capacity to negotiate between varieties could be considered as multilingual capacity. So, we want to connect it with the question of fluidity, that the minimal variation, minimal distinction at the level of phonology, morphology or syntax between distinct varieties of language would be connected with one another because of its nature of fluidity. The fluidity also means that there aren't rigid language boundaries. In other words, language boundaries are not rigid, they are rather porous. Languages merge into one another effortlessly, and one of the examples of this merging into one another results, one of the outcomes of this hypothesis of fluidity is mixing. We can look at several examples from well-known contexts of Hindi and English. However, this phenomena is not limited only to major spoken languages or only to these two, Hindi and English. However, let us take the example from Hindi and English and see the coinage of these terms. Some of them are names of different movies, they are Hindi movies, and some of them are names of different television serials or television programs in India, and most of them, all of them are in Hindi. it's the fluidity, it's the fluid nature of language, and it's the porous boundaries which allow this phenomena when we can come up with a term jab we met. So, without getting into the details, it sounds like somebody wanted to say when we met and came up with this attractive fashionable title jab we met, but this is grammatically and socially permitted a sequence of words and it is acceptable. Look at the next term English-Winglish. This comes out of a very productive pattern that exists in language. In this particular example Hindi, it is called echo word formation, where the first sound of a word changes to wa and rest of it gets reduplicated. So, the first sound of the word English is E, and we have wa in that place, and then the vowel continues and we get the echo word Winglish, which is semantically null, in other words would not mean a thing. However, this creates a Hindi phrase and the term is English-Winglish, which is an acceptable term, comes to be the name of a movie. And likewise you can go down the list and see the innovative use of mixing through very creative and very creative style and productive patterns available in languages, and thus we get several such examples. Again, I would like to add, such examples are available in all languages, among all varieties, and the two varieties or two languages tend to mix with one another, and the speakers of the two varieties or the speakers of the two languages allow them that phenomena to happen without a conscious effort or without much effort. To take some more examples at the level of sentence, these are some of the sentences from television commercials of different products. I only want to draw your attention to sentences and use of these words in this sentence. I am using these sentences without glosses for you to spend some time on this to make sense of this productive pattern of mixing. However, it is not difficult to get the meaning out of it whether or not you know one or the other language. Take a look at the first example. Perfect निखार के लिए क्या-क्या fairness treatment करने होंगे? The things in bold are terms from Hindi and rest of them are from English. Just look at it. At some point it is difficult to say which part of it is Hindi and which part of it is English. And if you do not pay close attention to this, this sentence could pass as a good Hindi sentence. This means, what all do I need to do for perfect fairness? Similarly, the second sentence from a commercial is, पहले तुम्हारी स्किन देख लें, spot, dullness, tan, dark circles और सामलापन, सबका fairness treatment करना होगा. Look at the use of terms in this sentence. I only want to draw again your attention to the uses of terms and the creativity of these terms between Hindi and English. Third, ये सिर्फ क्रीम नहीं, fairness treatment है. Cream, fairness treatment, all of these are the words from a different language, and the grammar of this sentence is Hindi with है. भारतीय रेलवे ने सफ़र को म्यूजिकल बनाने के लिए कुछ सेलेक्टेड ट्रेनों में क्लासिकल म्यूजिक व हिट रॉक ट्रैक सुनने की स्कीम बनाई है. Now, this is again a Hindi sentence, which means Indian Railways has arranged for classical music and hit rock songs, tracks, and this is for making the travel little musical, and the railway has come up with this scheme. If you read this sentence, it is difficult to put a finger on the boundaries of the two languages where one begins and the other ends. We are not going into the details, technical details of what is allowed to mix and what is not allowed to mix. In other words, the constraints on mixing is not the point that we are trying to make here. The point is, with an example of Hindi and English, we are trying to show that two unrelated languages will allow mixing because the boundaries are porous, because the boundaries are not rigid, and therefore, such a creative mixing. Of course, there are motivations behind why these things are mixed together, but we do not want to read into motivation at this point for the simplicity of the point. So, this is an example of how languages are fluid. I would extend the meaning of fluidity to more examples which follow shortly. However, the two terms that we know, Peasants and Creoles, are also part of this fluidity, which is the nature of language, and such things could happen. And once again, without technicalities, I would try to define these two terms. Peasant, the term used for the communication system which has got minimal functional patterns, that is minimal functional items in communications. Imagine a situation where two people must communicate and there is nothing common ground between the two. So, this is why I have indicated that the peasant arises out of situation when there is no common ground between the speakers of two different languages, and the strategies that they adopt to communicate results into a peasant. Such a thing has taken place and continues to take place is only because of the fluid nature of language. And it does not stop there. When such a language with minimal grammar and words from one language or both the languages and sentence patterns from either both the languages or one of the languages, they get regularized and comes up, and we know that kind of process as Creole. The whole process is called creolizations. So, the terms peasant in particular and also Creoles are outcomes of the nature of language, which is fluidity. Such a fluidity follows from the basic understanding of language, dialect and variety, where we want to stress again and again that language is only a superstructure like a phoneme, and people only speak dialects on ground. People only speak different varieties of that superstructure, and that helps us reduce the load of some groups speaking standard varieties and the others non-standard varieties. However, that remains to be a social question, a problem that we have to undergo in order to understand language and society. Now, we extend the term fluidity into continuum, and we brought out the term fluidity from the possible capacity of humans to negotiate between varieties, and the term continuum simply connects those varieties to create a longer chain. And so, let us take again the example of Hindi and create a continuum of Hindi. So, like we have mentioned several places where Hindi will be spoken with its distinct identities, we can roughly say that Hindi in one form or the other, even in a minimal sense, can be possibly used beginning from Kabul in the west and Kohima or Rangoon in the east, and everywhere else in between. Somewhere in some places one or the other varieties would have more number of speakers, and in some other places fewer. However, it could be used. There is no attempt to make any point in terms of geographical boundaries. It just the use of the term. If it creates any kind of difficulty in understanding, you can resize the continuum. But whatever size you want to begin, if you want to create a continuum only from Lahore to let us say Dhaka, or you just want to restrict it between Amritsar to Kolkata. My point is not the names of the places, the point is the continuum, and different varieties and their distinct identities of a superstructure term like Hindi would create a continuum which will have mutual intelligibility, and this is the question of continuum of one. Similarly, we can have a continuum of Tamil where different varieties of Tamil which are spoken in different places beginning from Ongole in the north to Tirupati to Chennai to Madurai to all the way to Kanyakumari and every other place in between, there will be several different varieties spoken in the geographical boundary of Tamil Nadu. Language continuum is also possible across language families. So, with the example of Hindi, we have seen the continuum of an Indo-Aryan language. With the example of Tamil, we have seen the example of a Dravidian language. However, a continuum is also possible between Indo-Aryan and Dravidian languages, or for that matter Tibeto-Burman and Indo-Aryan languages. Language families do not become barriers for a continuum. In fact, the true nature or the true definition of the nature of language fluidity which results into continuum is the fact that nothing becomes a barrier. So, if we start looking at this continuum that I have here on the screen, let us start with Assamese, and when we move southward from Assam, we see the Assamese is spoken in upper hills, upper Assam and lower Assam, upper Assam areas of Haflang and lower Assam areas of northern Guwahati, or all the way to Kokrajhar. There is a huge distinction between the varieties spoken in these places. In fact, there are names used. There is a place called Nalbari and there is a name used, Nalbaria Assamese, which gives a clear identity to a distinct variety of Assamese. So, and downward when we move, the moment we touch West Bengal, Assamese merges into Bangla, and then at that point it is difficult to distinguish between the two, but again there is a huge distinction between Bangla spoken bordering Assamese and then all the way in between and Bangla spoken bordering Odia. Similarly, there is a huge distinction between Odia spoken in the bordering areas where it merges with Bangla and everywhere in between, and then where Oriya merges into Telugu or Telugu begins. Similarly, and keep in mind, Telugu is a Dravidian language, and then when Telugu begins, that Telugu has strikingly distinct features if it is contrasted with Telugu is spoken down south, where it merges into Tamil. Now, it creates a big continuum, and then comes the question of, and such places are technically known as convergence areas. But whether or not we use the term convergence, the point is creation of continuum within the language or across families. To talk about convergence, as we know, it refers to the situation where two languages merge into one another, and at that point it becomes difficult to identify one or the other. This takes place across language families, and this has potential for creating new languages. We have looked at Assamese, but if we go further upward and we see the continuum between Assamese, which is an Indo-Aryan language, and Naga group of languages which are part of Tibeto-Burman languages, we see that such a convergence, such a contact area has created a new language, and it has its own name. It is called Nagamese, and that has acquired its own identity. It is not a Creole. It has moved from the point of being a Creole alone. These are just few examples. This happens, the main claim is this happens at every single point on the continuum. One more example to take, Tulu as a Dravidian language and Marathi as a Indo-Aryan language, when they merge with one another, the language that comes out of it is given the name of Konkani. And when we study various aspects of Konkani, we realizes what it is made of. So, language, it is easy to come up with a new language or to give the new set of identity to the speakers of a language with a new name, particularly when it happens across language families. However, this phenomena is not restricted only across language families. All these help us point out one single thing. The continuum, the creation of continuum, whether it is an outcome of convergence or fluidity, does not have to be in a continuous line. We have taken continuous lines only for the purpose of simplicity and understanding the point. It happens in all directions. It happens in all possible manners and makes the point that language is not really a countable entity. And because of these things, we could claim, and after going through these things, we can understand what we mean when we say it is not possible to count these languages with their minimal or maximal variations. So, it will be too radical to say that language is not a countable entity, rather it's more like a liquid, and therefore, the true nature of it lies in fluidity, which creates a continuum, and that is how it is. It comes up, it shows up in the real world where we use language. Thank you.